Today we're going to talk about the human rights situation in the Middle East and the role of the EU on the issue. So in the report of your trip to Northeast Syria at the end of 2020, you mentioned human rights violation in the territories controlled by Turkish troops after their incursion in 2019. Could you explain to us more specifically the human rights situation in that area?
Well, I visited the northeast of Syria in November last year. And I mean, one of the most apparent problems in terms of human rights is just that we are seeing so many refugees in the region, but the supply of humanitarian aid that would be needed to really take good care of them is not there. So I visited, for example, Al-Hol camp, where there are Syrian refugees, Iraqi refugees, but also many foreigners. The children didn't have warm clothes for the winter. There was only cold water. There was wind really rushing into the tents. And that worried me a lot. But of course, there were also many discussions about the human rights violations that were committed during the invasion of the Turkish into Northeast Syria. We have seen killings of civilians, we have seen abductions, we have also seen how humanitarian aid workers, like those of the Red Crescent, were directly targeted, but also politicians, most often female politicians, interestingly, like Hevrin Khalaf, who was killed on her way to Khamishli. There have been quite a number of, seized homes, looted property, and we have seen that very large group of especially Kurdish people that fled the region, or that had to flee the region that was occupied by the Turkish, and that until today could not go back to their villages, to their community, because they were afraid, or because they are afraid to go back, or because they're even blocked from just going back home. And we have also seen both sides, so the Syrian Democratic Forces, but also the Turkish, using water, for example, as a weapon for war. So just, stopping water to flow to communities to put pressure. It would be very important to have this kind of independent, impartial investigation into what happened, to ensure that there's accountability and no impunity.
Do you think the EU is doing enough to prevent these human rights violations in the region?
We could do much more, and we are not living up to the kind of rhetoric that we put in place. And we were calling for an investigation and for accountability of these war crimes. And the member states did not take our demands up as strongly as we had hoped to. So we still see arms exports to Turkey against Turkish officials for the escalation in the Mediterranean, so this whole gas issue. But we don't see the same sanctions for the human rights violations committed in Northeast Syria. And here, the European Parliament continues to uphold pressure, but we rely in the end on the governments of the EU member states.
And do you think that the EU human rights sanction mechanism recently adopted by the Parliament could be a solution to sanction the perpetrators of rights violations in the Middle East?
Well, I really think that we could make use of this human rights sanction mechanism to sanction individual perpetrators in Turkey, but also in other countries in the Middle East. But we also need to be very clear, this has to be just one step of many other foreign policy tools. So just sanctioning individuals is not going to change the situation as a whole. So the stop of arms exports, for example, but also of surveillance technology has to be another step. Diplomatic pressure has to be a step.
Finally, about 4 million of Syrian internally displaced people are now living in the Idlib province, where the humanitarian situation is said to be catastrophic, and some refugees that were living in Turkey have been reportedly illegally deported back to Syria, where they are at risk of serious human rights violations. So 10 years now after the beginning of the conflict, do you think that the international community is taking its responsibility with regard to the Syrian refugee crisis?
Well, I have to say, and that makes me quite sad if I look at the situation, that we are not really living up to the standards that we set ourselves. The first problem is in recent years, there was never enough money pledged for humanitarian aid in Syria and in this region of Syria. So the United Nations, they come forward with the kind of amount that they would need to properly, or as good as possible, take care of the refugees. And for many years now, this demand has never been met with pledges. in the different countries. But there is also the problem of access of humanitarian aid to specific regions. Idlib is one of them, but also the region towards the Iraqi border in Northeast Syria around Qamishli, for example, is one, Raqqa also, where the humanitarian aid coming through the Syrian regime is not enough to go up there. So there are some limitations to the humanitarian aid that comes through Damascus. And the cross-border aid that could be done, for example, through Iraq or through Turkey is also blocked because Russia in the UN Security Council resolution just restricted this cross-border access to one single point for Syria. And there could be much more humanitarian aid going into these regions if there were not these kind of blockages. So it's these two problems that are the biggest problems.
So thank you, Anna Neumann, for answering our questions and for defending human rights at the European Parliament.